Caliban and the Witch. Section: Women and Heresy. One of the most significant aspects of the heretic movement is the high status it assigned to women. As Joaquino Volpe put it, in the church, women were nothing, but here they were considered equal. They had the same rights as men, and could enjoy a social life and mobility, wandering, preaching, that was nowhere else available to them in the Middle Ages. In the heretical sects, above all among the Cathars and Waldenses, women had the right to administer the sacraments, preach, baptize, and even acquire sacerdotal orders. It is reported that the Waldes split from the Orthodoxy because his bishop refused to allow women to preach, and it is said of the Cathars that they worshipped a female figure, the Lady of Thought, that influenced Dante's conception of Beatrice. The heretics allowed women and men to share the same dwellings, even if they were not married, since they did not fear that this would necessarily lead to promiscuous behavior. Heretical women and men often lived freely together, like brothers and sisters, as in the agapic communities of the early church. Women also formed their own communities. A typical case was that of the Beguines, laywomen from the urban middle class who lived together, especially in Germany and Flanders, supporting themselves with their labor, outside of male control, and without submitting to monastic rule. Footnote: the relation between the Beguines and heresy is uncertain, while some of their contemporaries, like James de Vitry, described by Carol Neal as, quote, an important ecclesiastical administrator, support their initiative as an alternative to heresy. They were finally condemned on suspicion of heresy by the Council of Vienne of 1312, likely because of the clergy's intolerance of women who escaped male control. The Beguines subsequently disappeared, quote, forced out of existence by ecclesiastical reprobation. End of footnote. Not surprisingly, women are present in the history of heresy as in no other aspect of medieval life. According to Gottfried Koch, already in the 11th century, they formed a large part of the Bogomils. In the 11th century, it again was women who gave life to the heretical movements in France and Italy. At this time, female heretics came from the most humble ranks of the serfs, and they constituted a true women's movement, developing within the frame of the different heretic groups. Female heretics are also present in the records of the Inquisition. Of some, we know that they were burned, of others that they were, quote, walled in for the rest of their lives. Picture: a heretic woman condemned to be burned. Women had a large presence in the heretical movement in every country. End of caption. Can we say that this large female presence in the heretic sects was responsible for the heretics', quote, sexual revolution? Or should we assume that the call for, quote, free love was a male ploy designed to gain easy access to women's sexual favors? These questions are not easily answered. We know, however, that women did try to control their reproductive function, as references to abortion and the use of contraceptives by women are numerous in the penitentials. Significantly, in view of the future criminalization of such practices during the witch hunt, contraceptives were referred to as, quote, sterility potions, or maleficia, and it was assumed that women were the ones who used them. In the early Middle Ages, the Church still looked upon these practices with a certain indulgence, prompted by the recognition that women may wish to limit their births because of economic reasons. Thus, in the Decretum, written by Bouchard, circa 1010, after the ritual question, beginning of quote, have you done what some women are accustomed to do when they fornicate and wish to kill their offspring, act with their maleficia and their herbs so that they kill or cut the embryo, or, if they have not yet conceived, contrive that they do not conceive? End quote. It was stipulated that the guilty ones should do penance for 10 years, but it was also observed that, quote, it makes a big difference whether she is a poor little woman and acted on account of the difficulty of feeding, or whether she acted to conceal a crime of fornication. End quote. Things changed drastically, however, as soon as women's control over reproduction seemed to pose a threat to economic and social stability, as it did in the aftermath of the demographic catastrophe produced by the Black Death, the apocalyptic plague that, between 1347 and 52, destroyed more than one-third of the European population. We will see later what this demographic disaster played in the labor crisis of the late Middle Ages. Here we can notice that, after the spread of the plague, the sexual aspects of heresy became more prominent in its persecution, grotesquely distorted in ways that anticipate the later representations of the witches' Sabbath. By the mid-14th century, the Inquisitors' reports were no longer content with accusing the heretics of sodomy and sexual license. Now, heretics were accused of animal worship, including the infamous basium sub cauda, the kiss under the tail, and of indulging in orgiastic rituals, night flights, and child sacrifices. The Inquisitors also reported the existence of a sect of devil worshippers called Luciferians. Corresponding to this process, which marked the transition from the persecution of heresy to witch hunting, the figure of the heretic increasingly became that of a woman, so that, by the beginning of the 15th century, the main target of the persecution against heretics became the witch. This was not the end of the heretic movement, however. Its final consummation came in 1533, with the attempt by the Anabaptists to set up a city of God in the German town of Münster. This was crushed with a bloodbath, followed by a wave of merciless reprisals that affected proletarian struggles all over Europe. Until then, neither the fierce persecution nor the demonization of heresy could prevent the dissemination of heretic beliefs. As Antonino de Stefano writes, excommunication, the confiscation of property, torture, death at the stake, the unleashing of crusades against heretics. None of these measures could undermine the, quote, immense vitality and popularity of the heretica praevalvatis, heretic evil. Quote, there is not one commune, wrote James de Vitry at the beginning of the 13th century, in which heresy does not have its supporters, its defenders, and believers. End quote. Even after the 1215 crusade against the Albigensians that destroyed the Cathar strongholds, heresy, together with Islam, remained the main enemy and threat the Church had to face. Its recruits came from all walks of life, the peasantry, the lower ranks of the clergy, who identified with the poor and brought to their struggles the language of the gospel, the town burghers, and even the lesser nobility. But popular heresy was primarily a lower-class phenomenon. The environment in which it flourished was the rural and urban proletariat, peasants, cobblers, and cloth workers, quote, to whom it preached equality, fomenting their spirit of revolt with prophetic and apocalyptic predictions. End quote. We get a glimpse of the popularity of the heretics from the trials which the Inquisition was still conducting in the 1330s in the Trento region, northern Italy, against those who had given hospitality to the apostolics, when their leader, Fra Dolcino, had passed through the area 30 years before. At the time of his coming, many doors had opened to give Dolcino and his followers shelter. In 1304, when announcing the coming of a holy reign of poverty and love, Fra Dolino set up a community among the peasants of the Vercellese, Piedmont. The local peasants, already in revolt against the Bishop of Vercelli, gave him their support. For 3 years, the Dulcinians resisted the Crusades and the blockade the bishop mounted against them, with women in male attire fighting side by side with men. In the end, they were defeated only by hunger and by the overwhelming superiority of the forces the Church mobilized against them. On the day when the troops amassed by the Bishop of Vercelli finally prevailed upon them, quote, more than 1,000 heretics perished in the flames, or in the river, or by the sword, in the cruelest of deaths. End quote. Dolcino's companion Margherita was slowly burned to death before his eyes because she refused to abjure. Dolcino himself was slowly driven among the mountain roads and gradually torn to pieces to provide a salutary example to the local population. End of section.